hand it over to our speaker to begin.
All right, thank you so much, Sophia. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get going here. All right. There we go. We're up and running. All right. Well, I'm so happy to be here today. My name is Amanda Crutch. I'm the Agency Training and Development Manager over at Northern Illinois Food Bank. I have been at the food bank for about 5 years. I started out as a child nutrition specialist. I now work as a training manager for our agency network. And as I refer to agencies throughout today's presentation, I mean our food pantries and our soup kitchens. So at Northern Illinois Food Bank, we do serve 13 counties in Northern Illinois. So basically all the counties surrounding Cook. Cook County is handled by Greater Chicago Food Depository. We handle everything else around that area. So we serve a total of 900 plus feeding sites, 400 of which are those agencies I was referring to, those food pantries and soup kitchens, and that's who I mainly work with. But I'm excited to be here today with you and share how we are helping increase access to food for neighbors by helping our network of agencies adopt different neighbor-centric practices. So back in 2020, before the pandemic hit, we launched a new strategic plan, aptly titled Unite. So with this strategic plan, our focus was on showing success by reaching neighbors, especially those that we often miss, versus success through pounds and meals going out. So over the years as a food bank, we've gotten really good at getting pounds of food out to our network. And what we wanted to change gears and do was really focus on making sure, are we getting food to the right people, those that really truly need it? So that shift from pounds to people is what kind of accelerated this push to get neighbor-centric practices out to our network. Overall, our mission, like I said, is to increase access with dignity and convenience. So those two things are very prominent in the practices that you'll see presented here today. And again, reaching those that we often miss was the key. So before we dive into the details of how we did this, I'd love for us to just take a second to get to know each other a little bit better. My contact information is there. I welcome any and all emails for questions you might have following this presentation. But I would love to get to know a little bit about who you are as well. So if you're joining the call and you want to type in the chat box just your name and what organization you're with, and even your role at the organization too is helpful. I know in my 5 years here at the food bank, I've come to learn that many people that enter into the world of charitable food don't start there. We all come from different backgrounds, some from for-profit organizations. Myself, I come from a background in social work. Prior to my 5 years here, I was a training or a case manager for children and adults with disabilities for the state. So it was a shift for me, one that I have loved. I love being able to do something so tangible as to get people food they need. So go ahead and use that chat box if you don't mind, and let me know who you are. I'd love to see where everybody's from and what y'all do. All right, so my hope here today is for us to leave, or for you to leave with some great examples of how to get a conversation started with those that you work with in your community around implementing neighbor-centric practices. So I hope that you leave here with a roadmap of how to start that conversation and really feel comfortable with getting together with a group of folks in your community, asking what barriers are, what people are facing in your community, and then brainstorming together to find solutions that have been co-created with people that are doing the direct work with those neighbors. I do welcome questions throughout today's presentation. I'm going to remind myself to stop talking and ask for questions throughout the presentation today. But if you do have a question, feel free to unmute, shout it out, or put it in the chat box. I'll keep an eye on that. I know sometimes if you're like me, you want to ask a question right away before your brain can process the next thought and what's being presented. So I welcome that conversation today as we go through. All right, so as I mentioned, our food bank began a shift to focus from pounds of food going out to people being served. Our hope and what keeps us up at night, though, is making sure we're reaching every neighbor who needs food assistance, especially those we miss. That could be the person who simply doesn't know about our services, or someone who has limited transportation and maybe lives in a rural area. The very first thing we knew we needed to do as a cohort was to identify the needs and barriers within the communities that we serve. So back in 2020, when we launched the new strategic plan, we did start working with a great consulting group called See What I Mean. The acronym is SWIM. And so we began working with SWIM to help us develop a strategic plan around this new work and focusing on neighbors. So to execute on our desired goals, to improve neighbor-centered practices at agencies, SWIM helped us create a way to engage our agencies in the co-creation of best practices to meet neighbor needs and preferences. And thus the Unite cohort was born. We thought it was a good name, and we patted ourselves on the back for naming it Unite, simply because it matched our strategic plan, but also we love the acronym Understanding Neighbors and Improving the Experience. So this presentation is going to walk you through the details on how we formulated the cohort, organized our meetings, and shared our findings. Before we dive into all the details, though, in a nutshell, our cohort was a group of 20 food pantries who worked together over the span of 6 months to develop best practices around neighbor-centered practices. So as we started out with this work, there was a couple of questions that us as a food bank were really thinking, and we know our agencies were thinking it too. We really wanted to ask questions like who might benefit but is not using our services. So again, reaching those that aren't already coming to our food pantries. How do we reach neighbors who haven't found us yet? What kind of outreach are our network agencies doing? Do they have a Facebook page? Are they advertising on flyers still? And what is the best way for the community members they're trying to reach? Do our neighbors want more diverse foods? This is something, food bankers, if you're on the call, you might resonate with this, is like, we're getting in some great donations, but is it the food that neighbors really know how to cook and prefer based on the community that we're serving? So really diving in and making sure we have the right foods that people want as well. What are the barriers to our services and how do I remove them? So what makes it difficult for somebody to get to a pantry? Is it the hours that they're open? Is it their location? Are there different kinds of rules that maybe somebody that has mobility limitations can't abide by? So what are those barriers? And then lastly, how can we help people feel more welcome? Making people feel that their voices are heard, their needs are met is something that's truly important when accessing charitable food. It's hard enough to make that first decision to step in the door. And we want to make sure those that do feel comfortable. All right, so to kind of lead into the cohort, back in 2021, we launched our first ever agency capacity survey. The results of the survey is what kind of led us into how we were planning to manage our cohort and helped us identify the barriers and the neighbor-centered practices we wanted to focus on. So when we launched the survey, we have over 400 agencies in our network. 200 of them took the survey, mainly our food pantries, so we were happy with that number. And what we were excited to see, we asked the question, how ready are you to serve more neighbors? And the majority of folks that took the survey, 137 of them, said either they're ready to do it right now or they're ready to do it but needed some extra support. So that excited us because we were ready to provide that support in the form of this cohort. The agency survey also asked about agencies' readiness to implement different neighbor-centric practices. And so while we know there are tons of neighbor-centered practices agencies can implement in their communities, we knew we had to narrow our focus down just to help make this project tangible for everybody involved. And so we kind of came up with what we lovingly refer to as the Big Seven, the 7 practices that you see there on your screen. And what you're looking at is our adoption curve. So we asked agencies in the survey to plot themselves on this curve of where they were in implementing these 7 practices. So the left side of the curve where you see the 0%, that's representing those agencies that are maybe interested in it. And as you go up the hill, you're kind of seeing the agencies that are trying it out. At the top of the hill, you got those that are really making it work. And then towards the right side are those agencies that have implemented these practices and it just becomes second nature to them. So you can see the 7 practices of removing quantity limits. So that involves making sure that when a neighbor comes in, they're able to get the types and the amount of food that they want. So instead of saying you're allowed 2 cans of vegetables, you're just allowing the neighbor to choose exactly what they need for their family. Adding weekend hours and adding evening hours is next. Just expanding that access for neighbors that are working. Majority of people accessing food pantries are working individuals, and so we want to make sure we're increasing access for them to get to those pantries in the evening and on weekends. Increasing shopping trips allowed. A lot of our food pantries currently do limit the number of trips allowed. So they'll say you're allowed to visit once a month or maybe twice a month. We're encouraging our network of agencies to open up that accessibility to say we're open once a week. And that mimics just traditional shopping patterns for any of us. Reducing or eliminating geographic restrictions is another practice. This one is interesting because we do have some agencies that, based on certain grants and things like that, they might have to sit and kind of abide by those rules to say they're only going to serve this county or this community. But it's been interesting as we've gone through this process and have started telling our network, hey, can you consider removing your restrictions? Majority of people, that has been an easy yes for them. And so we're seeing a great influx of agencies that are removing that limit right now. Last but not least, we've got providing more choice and providing more nutritious foods. You see those practices more on the right side of that curve because those are practices we've been helping our agency kind of take under their wings for the last couple of years now. So providing more choice and more nutritious foods is something almost every agency in our network is raising their hand saying, I'd like to do more of that. So we do have quite a few agencies who are implementing those practices very well. All right. So let's dig in a little bit deeper to the survey and the results and what we were able to see. So as we asked agencies in the survey, are you interested in removing quantity limits or adding more nutritious food? We then followed up with that to ask what services or supports do you need more assistance in to accomplish that? So we created this wheel of capacity and we asked people, do you need more assistance in marketing, partnerships, food, infrastructure? And so the interesting thing we noticed was that for every question we asked, food and infrastructure was no surprise top of the list for agencies needing more support in, but close behind that was understanding neighbor needs. This excited us because we knew that as this new strategic plan rolled out, we were going to be focusing our efforts on neighbor data and understanding what community members wanted. So we were happy to see that play out in these survey results. Here's another example when we asked about removing quantity limits, what kind of support do you need? Again, food and infrastructure was top. You also see funding there being a concern, but again, close behind that, understanding neighbor needs. So again, we were really happy to see that our network was ready to have this conversation. All right, so with the help of our consulting group, we were then able to narrow down the scope of those neighbor-centric practices into 3 main categories. We narrowed it down even more. So we have the big 7, but when we're talking about neighbor-centered practices with our agencies, that can seem overwhelming. And it's kind of like that idea of like, well, where do I start? So we started using this language of adding an option, making it easier, and sharing the word. We started using this language in our cohort meetings, but also just in our weekly newsletters out to our network as well. To the point where we have agencies now that'll get on a call with us and say, oh, let me tell you how I added an option for a neighbor today. And it's just become kind of an exciting momentum people can get behind, and they want to share the new things they're doing at their food pantries. So having this kind of consistent and precise language, I think really helps when you're working with a network of agencies who are 52% volunteer-led. They're not looking at this data and this information daily like we are in our food relief organizations. So the easier you can make it when having these conversations, the better. So I know I mentioned that we have the big 7. I do want to mention too that, we had plenty of agencies saying they had other ideas for neighbor-centered practices, and we supported that and cheered them on with whatever practices they wanted to implement as they joined this cohort. We also tried to use the language of, neighbor-centric practices being a match or mismatch for some community members. And so we help them understand that just because maybe you weren't implementing a certain practice, it didn't mean that it was bad or wrong, but it just might have been a match or a mismatch for that specific community member that they were trying to serve. We did some data and learned that the senior population, when they were accessing services, they really appreciated having that sense of community when they came in to get food. And so some pantries, do a great job of like offering other wraparound services and being extremely welcoming and having a personal shopper go with them. While we noticed the Latinx community, they were more so interested in just coming in, getting their food and leaving. And so if you have all those wraparound services and you're trying to be super friendly with them when they walk in the door, that might be a turnoff for that population of folks. And so we just talked a lot about how services can be a match or a mismatch, not right or wrong. All right, so now that I've walked you guys through some of the history and context of how we got this conversation started, I want to show you how we went from gathering all the data from our survey to implementing our very first ever agency cohort. All right. So we defined the purpose of our cohort by finding ways to add options, remove barriers, and share the word. Our ultimate goal was to create and share best practices. So when we gathered our 20 agencies together and told them what they were going to do, our focus was on telling them, hey, you're going to be the innovators that are going to figure out how to implement these practices and share best practices with the rest of the network. So that was our motivating factor. That was kind of what kept everybody on track going through this 6-month process. There was also an importance of us telling them what the cohort wasn't. So the food bank was not there to force agencies to change or implement anything specific. I think a lot of times we think of the relationship between our food bank and our network as like a monitoring site, and we're coming in telling them what they're doing wrong and that sort of thing. And we wanted to be clear that that's not what this was. We also wanted to let them know that we didn't have all the answers. This wasn't a training. We weren't going to be having them sit down and listen to us speak for forever, and then that was the end of it. We wanted them to know it was going to be an engaging, collaborative environment. So yeah, that was, I think, a key learning going forward for me as a trainer as well, was helping people understand what a training or a webinar was not going to be. So it was extremely helpful to kind of set the tone that this was going to be an engaging and very activity-filled environment for everybody. All right. So how were agencies recruited? We started the recruiting process back in November of 21. The cohort launched in December of 22. So we opened up an application to our entire network. We had 20 agencies applied and we had 20 agencies accepted. So their interest and motivation to fill out the survey and the application was good enough for us to say, yes, you're going to be a part of this cohort. We did place an emphasis on advertising this opportunity out to our priority counties. So those counties where we knew that we needed to do more to reach the need in those areas. We made a specific ask to those agencies to join. Out of our 4 priority counties, we had 2 represented in the cohort. The benefits for the agencies joining, we did give them a $3,000 grant to join the committee or the cohort. And we put very little restrictions and parameters around that $3,000. It was simply, you got $1,500 at the beginning of it. And then at the 3-month mark, you got another $1,500. And that the intent was to use that money to implement whatever practice they were going to focus on. Along with the money, they were obviously given this opportunity to be a part of this group, ask questions, get access to data, and all those types of things as well. As we look at a closer look at the 20 agencies that participated, we can just see the breakdown of how many were volunteer-led versus having paid staff. The ranges of the budgets they had. We had some that had a very little budget, up to $250,000 a year. I would say the average for our network is about $50,000 a year. And a variety of agencies in the way of how many people they serve a month. So we had a lot of big agencies, but we also had a good mix of those smaller ones. We wanted to make sure within the cohort all the voices were represented. All right, I'm going to pause here for a second and just see if there is any questions. Again, feel free to unmute and ask or type in the chat. All right, I'm looking at the chat. I'm seeing who you guys are. So I see a lot of folks that are representing Food Pantry Life. So happy to see you guys here. All right, so how it all worked. So the way we organized the cohort experience was in 4 main chunks, I'd say. We got started though with a hackathon. We're gonna go into all the pieces of the puzzle, but up first is the hackathon. We spent in December preparing for this meeting. We had like a pre-meeting, got everybody together in the cohort, all the 20 agencies, and just kind of met everybody. And then in January, we hosted a hackathon. It was a 3-hour Zoom meeting where we really dug into the data and the communities that were represented within the cohort and asked them to start brainstorming on what barriers you're seeing with the communities you're serving, and then what are your, what are the communities you want to focus on reaching more. So we showed them data. We actually created individual community cards for every community represented within the cohort, and shared with them like poverty level, internet, homes without internet service, and unemployment rates, all the different data points that would be key in food insecurity. We were able to give them a map to show who the neighbors were that they were serving in their communities, and that helped them finally land on what barriers they were focusing on and what communities they want to be focusing on as well. The goal of the hackathon was to give them a ton of information and then do some really quick brainstorming. The whole goal of the hackathon is progress over perfection. So you're not looking for, the perfect solution, but you're just trying to get started. So this 3-hour-long Zoom call really helped set the tone for everybody getting to know each other and figuring out where they wanted to start as far as which community they wanted to focus on serving. I figured it'd be helpful for us to just kind of give a go at it here in this workshop. So this is an example of one of the data cards we showed our network. We had data cards for communities including African-American population, Latinx, families with children, seniors, and veterans. You're seeing the card about veterans. And so on this card, we were able to give a little story about Sam. And this is actually data that was received from another consulting group, Boston Consulting Group, went out and did neighbor interviews with our network, and they were able to put these stories together. And so it tells us a little bit about Sam. I'm just going to give everybody about 60 seconds to read through that first section, and then we'll come back and talk more about what we asked our agencies to do with that information. Okay, so in the story, we're seeing some information about Sam. He mentions he returned home with PTSD. He had found it difficult to keep a job, but didn't get all the assistance he needed at the VA, and struggles with some stigma as well around accessing charitable food. We then see some general data about veterans, and then the biggest food challenge is listed below. And so in the challenges sections, we can see for access, he needs a place where he can, access and feel included, regarding his mental illness. He might not feel comfortable accessing charitable food, maybe because of the long lines he might have to stand in, or just not knowing enough about the pantry or what to expect when he goes in those doors. Empowerment wise, he's always been a strong, independent person. It's hard for him to ask for help. So that stigma that we oftentimes see neighbors faced with when choosing to get charitable food. And then also he mentions that he didn't grow up cooking many meals for himself and was still unfamiliar with how to cook. And so nutrition education was something that he could probably benefit from. So we let agencies kind of digest this information. We asked them to think about the neighbors they were seeing coming to their pantries and what other barriers they thought these communities were facing. So we would ask, what other barriers do you see veterans facing in your community? We then asked them to kind of rate how they're doing to support those barriers that they were listing. So they were able to digest this, kind of formulate some initial thoughts on what communities and what barriers people were seeing. And then they were then given the option to fill out a cover story worksheet to help them get started with their plan. So we knew by the end of the cohort, we wanted everybody to kind of walk away with their own strategic plan with how they're going to implement this practice, the neighbor-centric practices. And so this was the first worksheet we gave them. And I do have this available for download in the resources section. So on this cover story, they're able to identify their population. They're able to jot down notes about what resources they already have at their pantry that work well and what they might need to consider in the future. After we created that cover story, we realized that there was a need for some additional worksheets as well as we went through our 6 months together. So as we started meeting monthly with the group, we also developed a planning worksheet agencies were able to use to track their progress. So the cover story was the first worksheet. The planning worksheet came in around month 2, and that really detailed more so kind of what practices they were going to implement, how they were going to get started with it, what resources they needed. And then last but not least, based on that information, we are working on creating case studies on everything they put together so we can share that with the rest of the network. This is an overall look at the schedule of meetings that we had with the cohort. So we met monthly with everybody in the group, and then we asked the accountability to groups meet once a month as well, without the food bank in the room. So once a month they met with the whole group. Once a month they met with their individual accountability group, and we did that from December through June. During the all cohort meetings, once a month, they were held via Zoom, but we were very intent on making sure every meeting had a theme. And so we focused the themes on the language we wanted to be consistent, adding an option, making it easier, sharing the word. And at every cohort meeting, we invited a food bank team member to talk about what we were doing at the food bank in that category, and invited a cohort member to speak on what they were doing at their agency in that category. So it was really a great opportunity for us to build relationships between our food bank team and the agencies within our network, and really help them understand that they are experts in the things that they do and that we could all learn from each other. These meetings were recorded and information was shared out in our newsletter as well. So we were giving updates to our entire network about the cool things that the cohort members were doing. We made each meeting a very collaborative space, and we were sure to add a variety of activities to keep the virtual meetings engaging. Some examples of that, during our hackathon, we actually mailed out packets to all of our 20 agencies and gave them red and green yes and no cards. And then during every meeting, we'd ask them to respond to questions using their cards, and that kept everybody really engaged in this virtual setting. So some of the questions we would ask would be like, my agency is completely volunteer run, and they would hold up a yes or no. Or my agency does have its own Facebook page, and they would do their yes or no cards. People seem to really enjoy that kind of engagement. Another kind of engagement we offered was click and connect opportunities during those calls. So we didn't want to just keep everybody in the big group together. We knew that better conversations sometimes happen, especially for those that aren't comfortable sharing on webinars, in smaller groups. And so we would do click and connect opportunities where we would put 2 or 3 people in a group together in a breakout group and let them discuss a question. So we would give everybody the same question, but then break everybody out. Again, this really helped develop some trust and relationship building within the cohort members as well, which is exactly what we wanted. I would say my favorite thing we did was create these accountability groups. So as I explained, the cohort as a whole met once a month, but then we put everybody, broke everybody out into groups of about 4 to 5 in these accountability groups. We struggled a little bit with thinking about, okay, as a food bank, do we need a food banker in each accountability group to make sure everybody's doing the work they need to be doing? We landed on no, and I'm so glad that we did that. I think by us stepping out of the room, it allowed them to really have some intimate conversations and share how they truly felt about different things. And again, help them build those relationships. So in those accountability groups, they were asked to kind of do their homework, whether it was planning, filling out their planning document or problem solving on, what resources they were going to share at the next meeting. So we would give them a tiny agenda to follow, but the food bank was not in those rooms. And really that is where the magic happened. I would get so excited to hear reports from the accountability groups later that said, I went to go visit, Barb Food Mart. I went to go visit so-and-so. And just to see that connection within our network happening was excellent. This is an example of the agenda we would give our accountability groups. So just very kind of simple, straightforward, just something to look at and talk about as they got their conversations going. All right, and to give you a little bit better of an idea of what we experienced within the cohort, I'd love to share a video with you that showcases how these cohort meetings looked. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my share and reshare so you guys can see the video. Bear with me while I do this. All right. Here we go. I am worried we are not reaching groups of neighbors who need help with groceries. more people knew about my agency.
How many of the pantries that are online have an executive director who's a paid position? Let's go full-time paid position, full-time paid position.
Director.
All right, now how about any kind of paid position?
How many people are back to clients in the building as opposed to parking lot pre-packed? So you guys all have, do you have clients in the building? Not a lot. So it's kind of a mix.
We did ask you specifically to share about the strengths your neighbors have and the strengths you see in your neighbors, because that is the driving force behind our strategic plan and behind the work that we're going to do in the Unite cohort.
You were able to connect with different people during all the groups. I thought that was cool.
Just the enthusiasm of being with such high caliber people to be able to know that you don't have to tackle this problem by yourself, that as a group of fine individuals that we're able to do this together, and just more is many hands makes light work. That's just it.
All right, so you saw a couple of our cohort members there sharing their thoughts, and I would say, just generally speaking, the feedback we got out of the cohort was that people were so happy to feel that they weren't alone in doing all of this. So I think it helped us as a food bank too feel comfortable coming to the table without all the answers and just letting people get to know one another and work together. All right, let me reshare my screen. There we go, back in business. All right. So after we, did our 6-month stint together, we quickly realized that we really needed to go out and visit our 20 agencies. And we knew that we wanted to capture a way to showcase to our larger network what we did as a small group. And so me and my training specialist, Kelly, took upon ourselves to go visit all 20 agencies, and we recorded interviews with the people that were in the cohort as well as their volunteers, and actually took video of them implementing their neighbor-centric practices. So that could be videos of agencies that started offering choice in their drive-up line. We had agencies that hired, bilingual food pantry coordinators and were able to help those Spanish-speaking neighbors in line seeking food assistance. So just a wide variety of different practices we're able to capture on video, and we're creating resource videos now for our network so that if an agency says they're interested in adding hours or they're interested in removing quantity limits, they can click on a video and watch how a couple of agencies were able to do it, which is really, really exciting. I think it was also awesome to be able to go visit these agencies without a monitoring lens on, just to say thank you for all the hard work and the cool things that you're doing. I would say it was my favorite thing was just getting to meet the volunteers at our food pantries who were so proud of the work they were doing. All right, some other ways that we decided to share out the good work that our cohort did with our agencies was at our agency conference. So we host an annual agency conference. Ours just happened in September. And so we actually invited all of our cohort members to participate in a neighbor-centric fair. So just imagine a science fair. It was set up like that, where we asked each of our participating agencies to, create a poster board and have table materials available for people at the conference to come and see what they did and ask questions. So we had a room specifically for people that are agencies that were working on nutrition. We had a room for people that were adding hours, one for people removing limits, and then one for different choice models of distribution. So it was a very fun day of learning and getting to know agencies and how they were doing this awesome work. These are just some pictures from the event. We ended the day by coming up with a bumper sticker, and if you can see it on the screen there, it says "Feed People, Build Community." So we're working on creating a bumper sticker for all of our member agencies that participated, so they can start advertising, what they're doing in the network. All right. Another way we started to share out what our findings were through our agency portal, so our web portal. We started to just showcase the different things that were being shared out in our cohort meetings. So as I mentioned, in our cohort meetings, we hosted them around those different categories, adding options, making it easier, sharing the word. So this example is showing when we talked about adding options, we had 3 agencies that were in the cohort present on how they were adding options for neighbors. Some presented on online ordering, some talked about Saturday distributions. And so we recorded that and then just kind of snipped that out and shared it with the entire network so people could start getting a glimpse into how agencies were doing these practices. We also shared it out in our agency newsletter that goes out once a week to all of our agencies. And so, like I said, we now have agencies coming to trainings and meetings saying, this is how I made it easier for a neighbor. And so again, just sharing out that language consistently with your communities, I think is really helpful in building that momentum behind something like this. All right. Any questions thus far? I'm going to go into sharing now the outcomes of what practices agencies actually implemented. All right, let's get started. So we saw a lot of changes. A lot of agencies were saying it was just simply a shift in perspective and what they do from being such a simple task or seemingly simple of just getting food into their door and getting it out to really putting on that neighbor lens and making sure they're doing it in a way that welcomed everybody. Some cool changes we saw. One of our agencies started using United Way and DoorDash to bring deliveries to their neighbors. So DoorDash is actually offering us, a free partnership to deliver these free groceries to neighbors. How cool is that? So we had several agencies that started doing that. We had a agency that started to connect with Latinx churches in their area. They realized they had a large Latinx population that they weren't seeing coming to their agency. And so they partnered with this church and now are seeing a huge increase in Latinx neighbors showing up and receiving food at their door. We had a school pantry that also participated, and they created welcome packets for all of their new families that just really explained what to expect when they come to a pantry, what kinds of food that they could see. And they're also serving their agents or their neighbors as well to get feedback on what types of food that they would like. So very cool changes. 28% of our cohort doubled their neighbor-centric practices, which is huge. 52% of the cohort saw an increase in their neighbor-centered practices in general. And then 55% of the cohort members who didn't see an increase were already implementing 4 or more neighbor-centered practices. So they were just able to kind of hone their expertise in those areas over the 6 months that we spent together. I will say one of the tricky things we found in this process, some people are really focused on the data and they wanted to know, explicitly like how many agencies did what and at what point. And if you work with food pantries, you know that it really is, based on their volunteer base. And if there is changeover, it can be difficult to continue certain practices. And so there is kind of an ebb and flow in our network with, maybe they tried to remove quantity limits. It was really hard, so they pulled back for a little bit and they tried again 2 months later. And so we as a food bank have determined that we're going to start tracking trends yearly. It was too much to be asking our cohort and our agencies at large every month, what neighbor-centric practices are you implementing? So we're just going to continue to do that yearly through our agency capacity survey and hopefully start to see trends increase. We did, at the end of the 6-month stint together, though, have some really cool findings that we wanted to share. So 13 agencies expanded their distribution model. We had, like I mentioned before, some people doing an online ordering system. A lot of our pantries are still doing drive-through, and so they started to add choice options to that drive-through system, whether it was a sandwich board in the parking lot and people were able to select what they wanted, or a Google form going out prior to distribution where people can make their orders that way. We also had some agencies, because of the cohort, decide to go back to in-person shopping after surveying their neighbors. And so it was cool to see those transitions happening as well. All right, we had 18 agencies add more nutritious food. So as you saw in that adoption curve in the beginning of the presentation, Nutritious foods is always at top of mind for our network. And so this isn't surprising that the majority of folks wanted to do more in this area. A couple of examples of what our agencies did. We had an agency start to use our Service Insights program, our client data intake system, to start to gather information on dietary needs of their neighbors. That way they could have, special end caps dedicated to, diabetic friendly food or heart friendly food, depending upon what their neighbors' needs were. We had an agency, like I mentioned before, create nutrition packets. And so there were little pamphlets, and inside of it was just general cooking tips, but then also recipes based on the types of food that they had at their pantry that month. And then we had an agency actually move into a new space and start offering clinical services for free. They had a doctor actually coming in once a week, and people were able to get just kind of overall wellness checks, along with cooking demos and all the other cool things they're able to do in their new space. So we saw a lot of momentum around nutritious food. Removing limits. So this was my favorite, I think, neighbor-centric practice, because you were either really excited to try it out or totally terrified. As a food banker, we know that our resources sometimes are limited. And there is that fear that, well, if I just let everybody get what they need, I'm going to run out of food. And so a lot of agencies were, scared to try removing limits for folks. The cool thing I noticed with this, though, is that we had an agency that was like, yeah, let me go at it. I'm going to try this out. And they just did it. Their next distribution, they let everybody, pick what they needed. And it was so cool to see them come back to that next cohort meeting and share. Everybody was like, what happened? What happened? And they were able to share that, it was great. Nothing traumatic happened. Neighbors simply came in and were able to judge for themselves what they needed for their families. There was a few that took more and some that actually took less. And so it was just a kind of a good reminder, I think, for everybody in the cohort that you can be surprised when you're scared to implement some of these practices and worried about how neighbors might respond. You can be pleasantly surprised and find out that it works really, really well. Something else we told agencies to consider when trying out this neighbor-centric practice was it doesn't have to be all or nothing. We know that it's hard for us to sometimes procure milk or meat items. And so maybe you don't start there with removing all the limits, but maybe you start with your shelf-stable items first. So letting agencies know they can kind of start with baby steps was also comforting to folks, and let people ease into that kind of practice. But we had 13 agencies that essentially either removed limits in quantities of food people were receiving, the shopping shopping trip limits, and then also geographic restrictions. All right, so we had 13 agencies add more hours. We actually had one agency that wants to mimic grocery store hours, and during the cohort, they actually launched their Tuesday distributions being open from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., which is a really large length of time for an agency to be open. Typically, our distributions are about 2 hours. And so they recognized and were able to report back to the group that when they did this, it was a lot easier for the volunteers involved. And they were actually able to open up their volunteer base to more areas because it wasn't such an intense volunteer type job of like, you got to get, 200 people in and out in 2 hours. It was a trickle of people throughout the day. They were able to get volunteers that could come in for 2-hour shifts and kind of keep that agency open for that many hours at a time. So they're working on increasing that to evening hours and actually doing more days like that throughout the week.
Amanda, it looks like we have about 15 minutes remaining in the session.
Perfect. All right, thank you. All right, we also had 14 agencies start to serve the whole person. So interesting enough, this was not one of the big 7 we had, but we recognized a lot of our agencies really were concerned about providing those wraparound services for neighbors. So we had some agencies that were doing things, like I mentioned, the clinic being opened in one of them. We had a lot of them open up clothing closets and just provide referrals to other programs as well, whether it was SNAP benefits or referrals for housing applications, things like that. So throughout our experience working with these agencies over a 6-month period of time, we did learn a few things. And I'm excited to share those learnings with you guys too. And then looks like we'll have about 5 minutes left for some discussion afterwards. All right, so what did we learn? So centering our neighbor is a superpower for change. We learned that when we come into a meeting or a webinar or a training and we ask our attendees, who are our food pantries, about the neighbor first, it kind of sets the tone for the rest of that conversation, to be very focused on, we're here to serve our neighbors. Here's what their barriers are. Here's what their challenges are. Here's what their strengths are. We loved asking, what are your neighbors' strengths, and going off of that as well. It just helped to set the tone for the rest of the cohort and any other future engagements we've had thus far, when we center everything around asking about the neighbor first. We did realize that agencies of all sizes are important. We do have our big hitter agencies that they serve, 5,000 people a month and they're open 4 days a week. But then we also recognize that we have smaller agencies serving more niche communities, and those folks are just as important. Some people are more comfortable going to a smaller, we call mom and pop agency than a big box agency. So everybody of every size was welcome. We wanted to make sure we were getting, rural communities represented, urban communities represented, and those agencies that were just getting started out in a church, and those ones that have been doing this forever, and know exactly how and what to do to serve their communities. Everybody has a place. It was also very important for us to recognize everybody and what they've already done. So when they joined the cohort, I think it was really important for us to right out the gate tell them that they were the experts. We know that they've been trying and doing really great things with neighbor-centric practices for many years. We were just giving them a space now to come together and talk about it as a group instead of working kind of on their own in those areas. We also learned that people love to see data. They really digged into the data to help make those informed decisions about what communities they were going to serve. So one of our goals this year at the food bank is to become better data providers and be able to share out more regularly with our network the information we're learning from our service insights platforms, and making those resources available for our food pantries to learn and digest from, again, to make those informed choices. We also learned a lot about our role as a food bank. And I know if you're, on this call with maybe a different type of organization outside of a food bank, there's still that you might be like the larger entity of a community and you're serving those smaller community providers. And I just think as a larger organization, we had to learn a few things too. Being a good facilitator means creating an environment where people are comfortable being vulnerable and authentic. So we knew that we couldn't walk into the room and, be the leader of everything. We wanted to empower them to be the leaders. And like I said before, I think our best decision was kind of stepping out of those accountability groups and letting them do the work themselves. Great networks need great curators. There is power in gathering and sharing. And we have to recognize the food bank doesn't have to create everything. So again, letting them know that they're the experts and build those answers together. When the food bank visits and listens with humility, we build trust. It was super impactful for us to go and visit our agencies and really showcase and highlight that how proud we were of them for doing this work and how much it has impacted the communities that they're serving. And then last but not least, everyone at the food bank is responsible for building a strong network. And so one of the things that we wanted to accomplish in the cohort was really building the relationship between food bank staff and our agency network. Our agency team, myself and my 8 teammates do that really well because that's what we do at the food bank, but we have a philanthropy department and a community programs department, child nutrition department. And so we wanted to give all of them an opportunity to work with our agencies directly and to see how the impact that our agencies are making, and to also build those relationships so that if our agencies needed help with marketing, our marketing team knew how to better assist them by getting to know them better. All right. So it was definitely an event that was packed full of learnings for our agencies and ourselves at the food bank. My big takeaway from it was that the experts are there. Thinking back and being nervous about starting a cohort, wondering what is this going to yield? How do I even get started with this when I don't have all the answers about how to implement neighbor-centric practices? I look back on it now, and it was such an easy ask of our network. When we pulled them together and asked them to brainstorm on these practices together, their eyes lit up and they did the work without barely any assistance from us. So I would just recommend, if you're going to start a conversation with your community in this area, to just start it. Host that first call, and you'd probably be surprised at the amount of feedback you'd get and the amount of excitement around doing this kind of work. We are going to be asking our first cohort members to help us with our next cohort. So we are going to continue this work on in 2023. So our next cohort is going to be starting in January. And we are going to be launching our application soon. And we've already got people emailing us asking, can I be a cohort member? So I'm hoping that we get to 20 again. And I'm glad that I'll have the 20 prior members being able to support us as we go forward. All right. So I'm going to open up the floor now for any questions, comments from the group. And Sophia, I'm having a trouble seeing all of the chat box. It's coming through very tiny. So if there is anything in there, if you can help me with it.
I was just going to jump in really quick. My name's Kurt. I'm a referral specialist with the food pantries for the Capital District. So we're a coalition of, we're just about at 70 food pantries in the Capital District in New York. We obviously work closely with our regional food bank, but we're kind of in between the individual food pantry level and the food bank level. So our organization does a lot of the same kind of interactions with our members and constantly trying to see what we can do to improve services. I admittedly have been listening to your presentation in between calls with people that are, seeking food assistance. So I'm excited to go back and review the materials, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for the presentation. There were a ton of great ideas that I'm excited to bring back to our team. And yeah, it was just really inspiring to see what you guys are doing in your neck of the woods, and it sounds like you're doing great work. So like I said, yeah, just thanks so much, and I'm excited to bring this back to our organization.
Excellent. I appreciate that comment, Curtis. Thank you very much. We're all we're all wearing a bunch of hats at the same time in food banking. So thanks for kind of handling both during this presentation. But yeah, if you have questions afterwards too, like I said, my email address is available as well, and I'd be happy to connect outside of this.
Thanks so much.
All right. Any other questions? All right. I do want to remind everybody that there are some materials available for download. Sophia, I did upload these, so hopefully folks can find it somewhere within the Excel events webpage. But the 3 items that you can find are the cover story worksheet, the planning document, and then our Unite story report, which basically highlights everything that was shared here in the presentation today.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Amanda. Yeah, it looks like folks should be able to just scroll down and see the downloads below the viewing window. So if you'd like to try that to download those materials, you can do so. I just have a quick announcement before we go. Thank you very much, Amanda, for that presentation. That was great. And I just want to let everybody know that we have next, we have a 30-minute break and an opportunity to check out our on-demand content in the lobby. We'll then begin the next set of 5 workshop sessions. To join one of these 5 sessions, click Workshops in your navigation bar on the left of your screen. You can view all 5 workshops being offered by clicking the blue arrow to the right. Then click Enter the session. So that concludes our workshop for today. To exit this section, please click on the red phone icon at the bottom of your screen now, and then click Leave. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you have a really great rest of your day. See you later.
Thank you.